The purpose of this screencast video lecture is to introduce our discussion of indefiniteness doctrine. This second part focuses on theories of enforcement and on the various meanings of the word theory itself. We've seen that judicial enforcement of promises is far from the only force encouraging performance rather than breach. Wouldn't it be nice to have a theory of when and why we will resort to public enforcement? We'll consider a few candidate theories in a minute. But first, we should talk about what the word theory means when lawyers and legal scholars use it. Let's work our way through this diagram. In legal scholarship and academic discussions about law, it's common to draw an initial distinction between doctrine and theory. By doctrine, we mean the body of laws and legal rules, including statutes, regulations, the common law, and authoritative interpretations of those laws. When we talk about theory or theorizing, we're referring to any effort to bring some conceptual order to the unruly collection of laws that we call doctrine. Confusingly, both scholars and practicing lawyers also speak frequently about a doctrinal theory or a theory of liability. These usages of the word theory belong under doctrine, since they refer to the law itself rather than to theories about law. On the other side of the diagram, we can usefully divide theories into at least three broad categories. A descriptive theory aspires to nothing more or less than creating a taxonomy of legal rules or decisions. It gives us a new way of understanding law by identifying common characteristics and describing specific instances of law in terms of those characteristics. But describing decisions naturally leads us to try to predict future decisions. What if those descriptive characteristics influence outcomes? Then we might be able to categorize cases and make useful predictions about likely outcomes. This is the goal of predictive theory. But once we've developed a successful predictive theory, a new question immediately arises. Is this pattern of decision-making justified? Should these characteristics really affect outcomes? Well, yes, if the factor is legally and morally relevant, and no if it's not. The predictive factors will often point the way to solid justifications, but sometimes not. A normative or prescriptive theory thus seeks justification. Developing this kind of theory also requires us to decide what counts as a justification. Do we focus solely on the instrumental consequences of a legal rule? What role should considerations of economic efficiency play in determining the shape of legal doctrine? Are there deontological moral constraints that the law must respect? By now we find ourselves in increasingly deep philosophical waters. Lest we drown or drift out to sea, let's return to trying to understand when and why we have judicial enforcement of promises. We will usually focus on descriptive and predictive theories. These types of theory turn out to be the most useful for day-to-day legal practice. But recognize that a good predictive theory often implies a justification too. And developing a good normative justification for a rule may help us to predict case outcomes. This is how we've been using comparative advantage as a theory to help us understand what's reasonable. Now we can consider a few more theories that try to explain when we will see judicial enforcement of promises. The textbook hypothetical involving Bailey's instant retraction of his promise to sell his farm is a good test for candidate theories of contractual enforcement. Recall that disappointed with the result in Bailey against West, Bailey signs a written agreement to sell his horse farm to a neighbor. He walks outside and a dear friend convinces him that he should continue in business. He rushes back to tell the neighbor that the deal is off, but the neighbor insists. Then Bailey refuses to convey his farm. What do you suppose happens when the neighbor sues Bailey for the farm? Is the agreement enforceable? Well, it turns out that instantly retracted promises are enforced. That's the doctrine. A court might scrutinize closely to be sure that there was a deal, but no doctrine excuses performance when you retract, even right away after making a contract. That's more or less what it means to enforce a contractual promise. You can't retract. One naive economic efficiency argument against enforcement is described in the textbook. Some might say, it's inefficient to enforce this promise because Bailey obviously values the land more highly. After all, he's willing to give up receiving the agreed price in order to keep the farm. There are several problems with this line of argument. First, is Bailey even necessarily the highest valued user? We can't possibly know from these facts alone. A party's willingness to buy or sell at a specific price only reveals a little bit about its true valuation. All we know here is that Bailey must now value the farm at some amount greater than the contract price. And we know that the buyer too must value the farm more highly than the purchase price. But these facts don't answer the crucial question, how much more than the purchase price? Anything is possible, and so either Bailey or the buyer might be the higher valued user. Let's suppose for the sake of argument that Bailey is the highest valued user. Is it economically inefficient to enforce his agreement to sell? Do the parties have any options that would allow the farm to end up in Bailey's hands? Please pause the video now to think about this question. Jot down your answer. Did you come up with a good solution? How about this? If Bailey really does value the farm more highly than his neighbor, it should be easy to negotiate a deal to sell it back to Bailey. Thus, enforcing the contract will not keep the land out of Bailey's hands. He can offer it to buy it back, or to pay the buyer something to release him from the contract. We call this ex post bargaining. It's ex post because it's after the contract, bargaining because they're negotiating. So this particular efficiency analysis explains nothing. It makes a bad prediction about how the law treats instant retraction, and it doesn't stand up well to normative analysis either. Let's try again with another theory. Recall that we said people make promises to allow others to rely. That reliance is beneficial when the promise is performed, and detrimental if the promisor breaches. Presumably, legal enforcement has something to do with protecting this beneficial reliance, and it reduces detrimental reliance by making performance more likely. So maybe we should enforce promises only when people rely on them. In other words, one possible predictive theory is that reliance is what triggers judicial enforcement. When a promisor instantly retracts a promise, at least arguably the promisee has had no time to rely. This reliance theory of enforcement means that no reliance should imply no enforcement. But we already know that this is not a good prediction. Let's see why not and why that would be a bad rule. Think for a moment about a rule that conditions enforcement on reliance. Try to imagine how such a rule would work. What difficulties can you foresee? Please pause the video now to think about this question. Write down as many problems as you can. Did you come up with a good list? I think that 3 problems are particularly severe. First, ask yourself whether Bailey's neighbor, in my hypo, could have relied in some way, and how he would prove this fact. Although reliance is an appealing basis for enforcement, reliance may be quite difficult to prove. Changes in consumption patterns or other behavior might be difficult to link with a specific promise. It will be even more difficult if the only reliance is a change in the psychological state of the promisee, say, increased joy or changes in life plans. Second, we should ask, how much reliance do we need? Is a tiny bit enough, or must it be substantial in some way? We confront a serious line drawing problem. It would be difficult to decide how much reliance is enough to support a binding contract. Finally, think about what the neighbor might do to meet the legal requirement of reliance. Is there any danger of strategic behavior in response to the legal rule? I think reliance-based enforcement would have the perverse effect of encouraging quick and substantial reliance, even to the point of fabricating reliance. Such efforts would be an unproductive cost imposed by allowing instant retraction. So this rule creates perverse incentives for promisees. They would go out and buy some reliance. If you want your promise enforced, manufacture some easily proven reliance. Maybe you could get yours at Reliance R Us or Reliance Mart. So we best protect reliance by enforcing without proof of reliance. Instead, contract law relies on objective manifestations of intent to be bound. In this case, the best predictive theory arises pretty directly from the conventional doctrinal rule. Courts focus on evidence of contractual intent. They enforce when an objectively reasonable person would understand a party's outward manifestations to signal an intent to be bound. As a normative matter, this rule provides a comparatively clear trigger for contractual liability and allows parties to adjust their behavior at low cost with far less danger of strategic manipulation. In the next part of this lecture, I'll introduce the gap-filling function of contract law, and we'll think about what happens when the parties intended to contract but fail to specify fully their obligations.